Greetings, everybody. Chris Hislop from the Montana World Affairs Council, joined with Mick Mulroy from the Lobo Institute in Whitefish. Mick, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, Chris. Great to be back with you.
Well, it's great to have you here again, Mick. Mick joined us 2 weeks ago, and we're going to try to have this show twice a month. This is Global Perspectives on Security. In this show, we try to get past the headlines. We try to look deeper into the critique and analyses of issues that are affecting worldwide security. There is, never a lack of those issues for better or for worse. And certainly over the past week, we've seen all kinds of things. But let me more properly welcome Mick again. As many of you know, Mick is the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East. He's a retired CIA paramilitary operations officer and United States Marine. He's a national security analyst and co-founder of the Lobo Institute and a board member at the Plato Institute in Athens, Greece. So, Mick, I think the big story last week was the ISIS commander Abu Ibrahim al-Hashimi al-Qurayshi was killed during a U.S. Special Forces operation in northern Syria. I think we know that ISIS or the IS had emerged as a dominant global extremist threat over the past decade, but was largely dismantled in 2019 at the death of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Yet in recent weeks, or can I say recent months, there has been some resurgence. The UN said that ISIS may have $50 million in its coffers and up to 10,000 fighters across Syria and Iraq. So that's by way of background, but maybe you could zoom us in here a little bit on the more critical background of ISIS, what it is, and its threat, and then we can dig a little bit deeper into the U.S. Special Operations and what does that actually mean for this threat. So, Mick, over to you.
Well, Chris, first of all, great to be with you, and that was a great summary of our current situation when it comes to the Islamic State. The Islamic State, just as a really quick background, came out of al-Qaeda in Iraq. And they eventually became the dominant force, as you mentioned, for terrorism in Iraq and Syria, taking a caliphate the size of West Virginia and basically dominating over 1 million people. It was the U.S.-led global coalition that actually ended that so-called caliphate, working very closely with our Iraqi partners and the Syrian Democratic Forces in Syria, led by the Kurds. We did kill Baghdadi in 2019, and Karachi, who you just referenced, was the individual who took over. He was not as, he didn't have the same persona necessarily as Baghdadi, but he was known as a very, very competent operational planner. He had been in Saddam's army. After Saddam was killed and Iraq fell, we incarcerated him where he became more radicalized. And then he worked directly for Baghdadi, where he was known as the destroyer. He was vicious, extraordinarily vicious. And he was reconstituting the Islamic State, or what it used to be called the ISIS, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, back to something that was more effective. Before this happened, we saw a very complicated, complex attack on the prison in Hasaka that the SDF holds 3,000 former ISIS fighters, plus multiple attacks in Iraq and Syria. So they had proven that they were on the way back. They're nowhere near where they were, in 2014, 2019 time periods, but they were on their way, and they still are. So I want to commend, obviously, the extraordinary work that went into collecting intelligence to find Karachi, and then the extraordinarily brave effort that JSOC undertook to get there and do everything they could to capture him, trying to avoid what eventually happened, which was this individual using a suicide vest or explosive device to kill not only himself, but several of his children and wife.
Mm-hmm. So Mick, now if we kind of put this into a broader context, let's kind of back the time up here where we can see, these operations, Osama bin Laden, Baghdadi, Qasem Soleimani from Iran as well,
Mhm.
and now Qurayshi. So what is what is going on here, because I think planners and foreign policy people know that the nature of these networks, when you cut off the head another one appears, so it's not necessarily to end the operations of this terror organization. So what is it, Mick? What is the purpose of raids like this, and what what are we trying to do?
So, Chris, I mean, that's a very good point. We've killed all the people you've mentioned and several others, quite frankly. Yet ISIS, which started in Iraq from Al Qaeda in Iraq, like we already talked about, is now in 30 countries. So, unfortunately, this despotic philosophy, if you will, is spread all over the world, and we still keep killing both the leaders and their direct subordinates, and it's still happening. So I think that's a fair statement. However, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to kill or capture these senior leaders that are plotting attacks outside of where they currently are. So whether it's in Syria or Yemen or Somalia, this seriously disrupts their activities. And I think the evidence, I would say, is we haven't seen an attack the size of, say, 9/11 since we started this really strong CT effort. But I would, maybe this isn't a very popular thing to say, but I would look at this more as something that will probably never stop. I mean, we have crime, for example, and yet you don't see police officers sitting around talking about the end of crime and how we can stop fighting crime. This is obviously something similar. It causes huge disruptions in world economies and the safety of our citizens. But essentially, it's a philosophy, and it's almost impossible to end the philosophy unless you change the circumstances that cause it. So, and I don't pretend to have the answers to change that, but I can say that we got to kind of adjust the way of thinking to accept that we're going to have to keep at least a small portion of our national security apparatus fighting this as long as they're going to continue fighting.
Yeah,
and so we should always look at the off ramp.
I think absolutely, Mick. And then just since you mention it, of course, there are other tools available in the geopolitical toolbox. Not the least of which in the United States is diplomacy and engagement, also development tools, and so on. Are these also in play when we're talking about the global threat?
Absolutely. And like any of our national security objectives, we should lead with diplomacy. Our State Department should be the face of U.S. foreign policy all over the world. And that includes our national security. It's not separate. When we have to use the military or the CIA, that should be in support of our overall diplomatic-led objectives. Unfortunately, sometimes they don't have the effect we would like, and we have to use force, like we had to do with Qurayshi. Obviously, not somebody who we would like to sit at a table and discuss some kind of diplomatic solution. He's not interested, and neither of anybody in, say, ISIS, nor do we want to talk to them because we know that. But we have to lead with our diplomatic efforts, and also, to your point, the aid that we provide all over the world should be in support of what we're trying to do in our national security priorities.
Mick, there's been no lack of analysis on, following this raid and ongoing regarding the security threat of IS. You mentioned yourself some resurgent attacks. There has been a significant uptick in northern Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq. And so that's the background of the raid. If we zoom out even further, though, some of the analysis is asking, look, when we look at the current situation in the world and the United States, the threats that we are facing right now, Some people are suggesting the priority threat is kind of quote unquote authoritarian regimes, which is code for Russia and China and others, and that they're representing a more significant and immediate threat to, well, to the United States to a certain extent. I would say probably more like Western democracy, I suppose is the point there. So Mick, that analysis of saying, look, shouldn't we be prioritizing other threats? Fair enough, it's an analysis. What would you say to that?
So I would agree with the premise of the statement. We do have higher priorities in international security strategy and defense strategy, which was I was a part of developing when I was at the Pentagon. It places the authoritarian regimes you just referenced, China and Russia, as the number one and number two priorities, and that's where they should be. They are more of an existential threat to the United States than al-Qaeda or any of its offshoots ever will be. But we have the ability to do both. And I think even the person that asked the question understands that if we woke up tomorrow and there was say several car bombs that went off in Times Square and a couple hundred Americans were killed by an attack that emanated from Syria and the Islamic State, our priorities would shift for a little bit. And we would focus on that because when I say we, I mean, the national security apparatus of the United States have an absolute obligation to defend the people of the United States. And if that happens to be from, an al-Qaeda affiliate terrorist organization or a state like China or Russia, then we have to be able, or North Korea or Iran or any other that we haven't mentioned, we have to be able to do that. And we have the capacity to do that. The U.S. taxpayer spends considerable amounts on our ability to defend ourselves, and we should be able to do both. So I agree with the premise of the question that China, to a certain extent, which we can get into, but not so much a menace militarily, maybe economically, and Russia, who just seems to want to be the authoritarian that just needles the Western liberal democracies of the world, even when there's really no reason to, in my opinion. Obviously, there's a different opinion. We have to defend ourselves, right? And when I say we, I mean we are part of, I think, the most significant military alliance in history, NATO, and we have obligations under that. And this threat currently in the Ukraine requires us to be united and stand against this form of threat from Russia.
Well, Mick, it's a great opportunity to segue into a couple minutes on Ukraine, if we could, but I'm going to try to connect the dots here a little bit, as I think anybody would. What happens in one situation and in one part of the world is viewed and perceived, in capitals, in Beijing and in Moscow. So let's just take, for example, the American withdrawal in Afghanistan last August provided a certain perception of American strength. This raid, I presume, also provides a certain perception of what America is willing and capable of doing in terms of national security. So these signals are being sent and received, maybe in the way they're intended, maybe not. But nevertheless, maybe a first question that would lead you into thoughts on Ukraine is the timing of this raid and the tensions on the Ukraine-Russian border. Is this raid at all sending a message to Vladimir Putin and Moscow?
So, Chris, it is all connected, right? So, if you look at Syria, one of the reasons it allowed ISIS to be able to gain this foothold is the Assad regime, which is doing nothing about it. And who are they supported by? Russia. Russia has completely supported the Assad regime in Syria. This is a despotic regime that has used chemical weapons against civilians, including children, right? So that's why we had to go in there, we, the West, and solve this ISIS problem, which isn't completely solved. We've done a lot, but the enduring defeat of ISIS mission is just as important as the defeat of ISIS mission. And now we see Russia, who is threatening to invade a sovereign country that they've already annexed part of, based on some crisis that I quite frankly think they generated themselves. And essentially, they're making it worse. Everything they claim to be concerned about, they've caused to be exaggerated based on their, mobilization of 100,000 troops on the border with Ukraine, sending 30,000 more troops to Belarus on the border of Ukraine. And now they're sending a substantial naval armada of 30 ships, 6 of which support an amphibious assault force that's going to open another front against Ukraine. So then they wonder why NATO is now more relevant than it has been since the Cold War, why we've spent over 200 tons of weapons and equipment to the Ukraine, and why we're deploying forces to NATO countries, because of their actions, not ours.
So, just to update now, we spoke about Ukraine 2 weeks ago. In the interim, and particularly in the last days, we've seen a significant uptick in European diplomacy, with French President Macron talking with Vladimir Putin, and then we've got the German president talking with the United States. And it appears as though, Europe is seized of the matter, is attempting to broker some kind of diplomatic solution, albeit it's been, there hasn't been a resolution. The news today said, good meeting, thank you very much, but that doesn't move the 120 or 30,000 Russian troops away from the border. Mick, has anything else significantly changed since we spoke 2 weeks ago on Ukraine?
So I think what you just pointed out, Chris, is an important, not change, but event, right? So President of France, Macron, went to Moscow to talk to President Putin, and then went to Kyiv to talk to President Zelensky, which essentially is exactly what he should do, so that Putin understands that Zelensky is the president, and he is equally as important as the president of Ukraine, not Putin's Ukraine, and that he is equally important as Putin is. And I think that sends a message of itself. The other meeting you referenced also sent an important message. The Germans have been the most hesitant NATO ally in all of this. And there's a reason. They really rely on energy from Russia, and they do not have the capacity to do it themselves. Hopefully that changes. And they expressed, Chancellor Scholz expressed that that's the plan for Germany, that they don't have to rely on Russia for all their energy in the future. But right now, that's not the case. They did come out united. Chancellor Scholz and President Biden came out united, and there's going to be severe and swift sanctions on Russia should they invade, and the end of Nord Stream 2, which was significant. I know the Chancellor didn't want to say it, but he certainly didn't say that our president was wrong when he said that would be ended in an invasion of any sort into the Ukraine, and that would cost Russia dearly.
Yeah, indeed. Well, tensions still high on the Russia, Ukraine, NATO, US issue. I think that remains to be seen. Certainly, anybody who watches this closely is hoping for a peaceful and diplomatic solution at a very tense time. So, Mick, thank you so much for your insight into ISIS, and then shifting gears quickly to a seemingly unrelated, but as we see, related issue in the Ukraine. We really appreciate your insight. And let me also thank our very generous sponsors, the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, Stockman Bank, and Allegiance, who help us bring this and so many more international affairs programs to you. Mick, so let's get together again in a couple weeks. Let's see what's going on. Maybe Ukraine, maybe something else. We just always love to hear your insight into the security and geopolitical dynamics that affect us all over the world.
Absolutely. I look forward to it.
All right, Mick,
Great
be
talking.
well. Thanks everybody for watching. Be well. Bye-bye.